Hello and welcome to the MilVet Podcast. Your podcast hosts are Brendan Aronson and Tim Shaw. We are military veterans, entrepreneurs, and investors. Most importantly, we strive to empower military service members, veterans, and their families. We believe that every veteran deserves a career that fires them up, a career in which you can learn, earn, and build a world-class network. On this podcast, we interview civilian and military veteran leaders who are incredible founders, writers, thinkers, and investors. Our primary goal is to inspire you to achieve great things. Let's dive into today's episode.
I am delighted and excited to have Richard Haass join us today for the Military Veteran Podcast episode. Richard is a public intellectual who has covered national security, foreign policy, and domestic issues, and has taught at numerous institutions, written and led numerous think tanks, and had decades of public service. We're so very fortunate and lucky to have Richard, and we would like to start off with a brief overview of Richard's career.
Tim, good to be with you and Will. I've been extraordinarily fortunate in my career. Wouldn't trade it with many, maybe with a few, but not with many. It didn't come about because I planned it or designed it. It came about because I try to live by a few principles to put myself in situations, particularly when I was younger, where I thought I'd learn the most. Put myself in situations throughout my life which were really interesting. And as I got older, put myself in situations where I thought I could contribute the most. So I've tried to do that over the last 50 or so years. I'm not putting forward my life as a model for anybody, in part because I never had a base. I wasn't a career civil servant. I wasn't a tenured professor. I wasn't a partner in a law firm. You name it. I've had the kind of life it's perhaps only possible to have in the United States. In most other countries, early on, you've got to, in some ways, define who you are. You're either in government or you're not in government, or you're in academia or you're not. One of the many great things about being an American is you don't have to make those choices. Or if you make it when you're 20, you can change it when you're 30. So again, I've moved around a lot. I've been in government. I worked in my 20s for a Democratic senator, Claiborne Pell. First as an intern, then as a legislative assistant. It was my first taste of Washington. I've worked in 4 administrations at the Pentagon under Jimmy Carter in 79 and 80, at the State Department during for about the first 5 years of Reagan, in a couple of different bureaus. I worked at the White House for all 4 years of George H.W. Bush 41. I was the Middle East, Persian Gulf, South Asia guy, on the National Security Council staff. And then I worked for a few years for Bush 43. I was the head of policy planning at State, plus I was a roving ambassador, did the Northern Ireland peace talks, took on a lot of special assignments for either Colin Powell or for the president. And then on the outside, I've been a professor twice at Hamilton College and at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. One of the good things of that, it's always fun to teach at a school that rejected you when you applied. Again, America is a country of great opportunity. And then I spent a lot of my years in think tanks. First at the Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Spent a few years there. I was at various times at Brookings, spent 5 years there or so, 4 or 5 years as the vice president for the foreign policy studies. Spent time at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Spent 20 years as the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. So again, I've been lucky. It's been interesting. I'll leave it to you and others to decide whether I've made a difference, and if so, whether it was a positive one. And again, I'm not putting forward as this is a model, but it's worked for me. And what I'm doing now, I should just say, as this latest chapter, is I continue to write and speak with about half my time. But I hate the phrase public intellectual, but I really wish someone listening to this would invent a better phrase for people who are producing and trafficking in ideas not just among narrow professional elites, which is one of the problems with academia, but putting them out there, particularly policy relevant ideas. So I try to do that with about half my time. And the other half of my time, I'm now doing investment banking at a boutique firm here in New York.
One of the things that I've been really impressed with your career is the prolificness of your writing, and not just how many books you publish, but the quality of the books themselves. One of the more recent books is A Bill of Obligations, and it feels especially relevant in 2024 as we come through an election season, and we'll touch on that later. But my two favorite books are The Bureaucratic Entrepreneur, and we talked about that in person. But the other one is War of Necessity, War of Choice. And I'm curious, how do you carve time to write?
Well, the way to carve time to write is to know a little bit about yourself, and I should say thank you for those nice words. I'm a morning person, and writing takes enormous focus. It takes a lot of energy. So for me, if I put it off, it tends not to happen. Plus, once the day begins to happen, there's meetings, telephone calls, emails, whatever. So I get my best writing done in 3 or 4 hours in the morning. My first rule of success, to the extent I've ever known success, is never, ever, ever schedule or accept a working breakfast. Those are productivity destroyers. So I get up early. I get up at 5 every day. Might not be up early if you're a farmer, but it's pretty early for those of us born in Brooklyn. Some days I'll do television. Some days I won't. But I'm basically I'm writing by 7 o'clock at the latest. And I try not to schedule any meetings till mid to late morning. So if I can have several days a week or most days of the week where I have 3 or 4 hours of free time before I get into the day, when I'm fresh, I'm not distracted, I'll get a lot of writing done. So that's my first. By the way, most people can't write productively for more than 3 or 4 hours a day. The idea that you're going to spend 8 or 10 hours writing, maybe, but I've never known anyone who can do that. I think you do better in concentrated blocks. For me, the best block is in the morning. Sometimes I get a second wind in late afternoon. So that's the first thing I'd say. Secondly, for me with writing is I do it every day. And too many people, I think, wait. They accumulate mountains of material before they start writing, and I actually find that oppressive. The idea that you've done research for months or years, and then you're going to turn to writing. You have such a pile of research, it's very hard to get going. You're drowning in your own material. Also, most of that material will turn out to be irrelevant. So the other reason to write early is it'll let you know what you need, what's relevant. There's a lot of, I don't know if the word's tricks, but there's a lot of things about writing which can improve your productivity. Also be aware of what kind of writing you're doing. I find it useful to think about 3 classes of writing. Descriptive writing, which is just that. It tells you what's going on, what went on. You might get profiles of people, captures conversation, visual imagery. There's analytical writing, which is just that. It tells you not simply what is happening, but why it's happened. It answers the so what question. What are the consequences? What are the effects? What's the causality? And then there's prescriptive writing, which is the writing that gets into the area of recommendations. It's what do you do about it? What should you avoid doing about it? And it's not that one is better than the other, but there's 3 different classes of focus, and you ought to, again, as you set out, know what's your focus, what you're going to do. It might be 1, 2, or all 3. The only other thing I'd say for people who are doing, I'd say one thing about long writing, one thing about short writing. For long writing, when I do books, and I've done a lot of them, I find it useful to do chapter outlines, to basically write a paragraph about each chapter so I know what work each chapter will do. And often I'll write the introduction and the conclusion is the first. I want to know what I'm trying to do here, and I want to know what I want the reader to take away from it. I find that really useful. And then with short writing is don't try to do too much. If op-eds, 800, 850 word pieces, columns, try to do more than one thing. They tend not to do anything. So keep it simple if you're writing short. Then have one principal takeaway you want the reader to take away. Obviously, books or longer articles. I just finished a 6,000 word article for Foreign Affairs magazine. And that, with 6,000 words, you have the luxury of saying more than one thing. But with 850 words, I would strongly suggest you keep it narrow.
I want to riff off a few things you said. First is in the morning, I call that brain juice the most potent and powerful type. And I tell people the same thing. I'm like, I refuse to do anything that is not so critical to that. And so almost all my travel is afternoon or evening. And that's actually in some ways tying it to the military veteran audience, which is our listeners. Most of the raids that we do in the Army all happen in the evening or night. And it's because the enemy is usually chilling. The brain juice isn't as high. The other thing that you said that I found that I want to riff off of is also a military theme of OODA, which is observe, orient, decide, act. The whole John Boyd OODA loop, and your writing sounds very much OODA loop. You're constantly doing it. It's not just like sequential. You kind of learn and then you write. It's like, hey, I'm writing, iterating, and learning. And then the point you brought about public intellectual, I think from my lens as a entrepreneur / investor, it's essentially what a lot of entrepreneurs try to achieve with content marketing. We always tell our founders, like, we want you to be the biggest self promoter. We want you to be Don King. We want you to be like Don King, Mike Tyson's promoter, like big hair, like you get attention, and that usually helps you with you and your company. And we tell them you need to write more, you need to try to get more press. And I think the reason why there might be fewer, and I know we don't like this word, public intellectual, is I think a lot of the folks who are the thoughtful, smart people aren't doing enough self-promoting. So I know I threw out a ton of stuff there, but would love your feedback.
I'll disagree with the last one. I think a lot of people do too much self-promoting. We live in an age of almost unlimited self-promotion. Social media allows everyone to promote. Look, branding's important, marketing's important, promoting's important, but what matters is you have something to promote that has value. So there's way too much self-promotion that the content just isn't there, or it has no shelf life. So no, my focus wouldn't be on self-promoting. I mean, again, it's essential. And I used to tell the fellows who worked with me or for me at the Council on Foreign Relations, it's not enough to produce good stuff. That's the tree that fell in the forest that nobody's hearing. So yes, good ideas have to be promoted. You've got to get people to hear them or read them, and lots of ways to do that. But first, you got to have good ideas, and then you've got to be able to write them or say them in a strong way. So I would 90%. I think the focus ought to be on the content, and to me, the marketing the book or getting the that's, if you will, there's some cookbook things there. That's not creative so much as disciplined and focused. Essential, like all implementation, it's essential. It takes discipline, takes repetition. I get it, but no, the real thing to be a public intellectual, and again, I really do wish we could come up with a better. It sounds pretentious, so I almost never use. But these are people who put big ideas out there, not just among their 10 specialists who are members of the faculty who write for these journals that nobody can understand, but putting out big ideas that shape the way we think, the way we act, our politics, our economics, and we kind of know who they are. What a Larry Summers or somebody is in the economic space, and we could mention others in either economics, And you don't have to agree with them. They're the people, though, who essentially are the debate shapers and the market makers, if you will. But you've got to put out big, relevant ideas, and you got to then put them out, obviously, in an accessible way. One of the things I try to do, I actually have something of a division of labor here. I haven't talked about it, but there's a difference for me between writing for other people, say, who do foreign policy for a living, and there you can assume certain things. And often you can cut to a fairly narrow, specific argument or point. Whereas there's other things I write where I'm writing for a general audience. And the first thing I've got to do is really sell why they should even bother to read it or listen to it, why it matters, why it's relevant. And you've got to make it, again, accessible. You got to make them want to get to it. Fellow professionals, they're already there. That's what they do for a living. So again, you've got to be very conscious of what your definition of success is. What is the constituency you're trying to reach here? But again, the most important thing is having something important, hopefully big, hopefully relevant to say.
Speaking of big, important, relevant topics, one of them is the Middle East. Obviously, Hamas, Hezbollah, Netanyahu, really complicated. And the last time we spoke, I believe you mentioned that might be a topic area for your next book. Can you confirm or deny? And can you share a little bit about how you're thinking about it?
It's always dangerous to talk about a book when you're writing it, because for whatever reason you don't finish it. You're sort of putting out your failures or whatever. But no, I plan to write a book. I've started writing a book about the Middle East. Let me take a step back. Several of my more recent books have been a departure for me. And it gets a little bit what I was just talking about. I'm increasingly turning to articles for people who do what I do for a living. If I write for Foreign Affairs has a subscription. Maybe there's 225,000 people who subscribe to Foreign Affairs. Maybe 1 million people or 2 million people will read something there. But out of a country of 340 million, out of a world of whatever it is, 8 billion these days, that's a pretty limited percentage. Okay, so you're writing for a really small group. And there are people who, almost by definition, subscribing to something have shown their interest. So sometimes I'm writing for them. My last few books, though, have been for what I hope is a broader audience. And I'm writing for generalists. Often I'm writing for students. I have in mind college students or just quote unquote normal citizens, people who are doctors or lawyers or plumbers or electricians or teachers, but people who are not foreign policy professionals or people who eat, breathe, drink politics. So I wrote a book called The World, A Brief Introduction, which was written as a primer for people about the world. I wrote the Bill of Obligations. You were good enough to mention it. As a kind of primer about democracy and citizenship. Now I'm exploring the idea of writing a primer on the Middle East. There's so many. The Middle East has so seized the public imagination. It captures a lot of attention. Yet I'm struck by how little background people have in it. I have a lot of background in it, for better or worse. I got my BA in Middle Eastern Studies. I did my doctorate on this part of the world. I've worked on it any number of times in government. So I've read widely in it. So what I thought I'd do is try to write a book that would be a foundational book for, not to tell people how to think or what to think. They'll reach their own conclusions. But I want at least people to have informed opinions. Indeed, it gets a little bit at the argument in the Bill of Obligation that I want involved citizens. But even more important than being involved, the first obligation is to be informed. So I want people, as citizens in this case, to care about the Middle East. I think that's great. But I want them to care in an informed way. I want them to know some of the facts. I want them to know the essential history. And that's the purpose of what I'm writing, is I want to write a primer that gives people what I think is the foundational knowledge, so then they can join the debates.
The concept of home and away is something that is illustrated throughout your career, in terms of the positions you've had, the books you've written, and more recently the newsletter you've started, which is fantastic. I'm a subscriber. I encourage everyone here to subscribe to Home and Away, Richard Substack. Every Friday, he writes about topics internationally and domestically. One of the more recent ones, and to add a little bit of levity to this episode, is you really like the Olympics this year. And yesterday, I spent a fair bit of time watching the highlights of Serbia-US basketball, but there's been some incredible races. I'm curious of this year's Olympics so far. What's really kind of giving you joy?
One is I'm surprised how much I like it. I find it really compelling. And if we had had this conversation 3 weeks ago, I wouldn't have mentioned it. I felt detached. I wasn't looking forward to the Olympics. I can't quite explain why. Maybe because the last few I haven't felt all that connected to. So I didn't expect it. And why it's happening, not quite sure. First of all, the venues are amazing. Yeah, whatever it was, the beach volleyball under the Eiffel Tower. I mean, come on. How cool is that? So there's something there. Also, the hours of some of it, it's easier to watch. There's some amazing, what's the word? Personalities. There's both greatness and personality, whether it's Simone Biles or Ms. Ledecky as a swimmer, some of the sprinters, the basketball. I mean, yes, the basketball game, Steph Curry's game. I mean, and the fact that it looked like the United States was going to get beaten by Serbia. How good was that? Some of the track and field. But I've got to tell you, for all that, I am mesmerized by table tennis. The other day, I was hoping nobody saw me at work the other day, but there's a room where you can get coffee and all that. And I kept getting coffee and other things because there was a big TV on the wall, and there was this match between, I think it was the gold medal match between this young man from China and a young man from France. And I was mesmerized by their technique and by how different the game is from what we thought we were playing when I was a kid growing up. I mean, the gap from ping pong to Olympic table tennis, I don't know. I mean, I have to think of what the analogy is. Maybe it's something like street food or something to the fanciest Michelin, 4-star Michelin restaurant, Le Bernardin in New York. But it's just amazing what they do, and it's also really quirky to watch these guys as they prepare the ball and the paddle for serving. It's pretty high on the odd scale. I mean, let's admit it. So that's become. But yeah, I'm hooked. I'm a little bit worried because I don't know when this is going to be heard, but here we are. The Olympics are about to end as we record this. Assuming you're recording it and I'm a little bit worried. Like, what am I going to do? What am I late at night? What am I going to be focused on? It's the way I feel at the end of certain seasons when I can no longer watch the Knicks or the Giants or whatever New York team is giving me great frustration. I also, by the way, I should have mentioned the golf. I thought what Scottie Scheffler did was amazing. I also say one other thing about the Olympics. So many of these winners, you take the basketball team or you take a Scottie Scheffler. These are people who are pulling down, I don't know, 40, 50, whatever it is, $1 million a year. I love the intensity and the emotion they bring to it. When Scottie Scheffler was crying while the Star Spangled Banner was playing, there's a purity for all the cynicism of doping and the politics, whatever hypocrisy there is in the Olympics. There's still a degree of purity. To watch the men's basketball team not give up and essentially will themselves to win against Serbia, that was pretty impressive. because all these guys are going to have a very nice retirement. Whether it's LeBron or Curry, they're all fantastically successful. They're fantastically wealthy. But there was no way they were going to allow themselves to lose. I mean, how cool is that? And again, Scotty Scheffler, he's world number one. And the fact that he so wanted to win, or Djokovic in tennis, the one thing that eluded him after all the majors was the Olympic gold. And the way he cried when he won it, how can you not find this totally riveting? At least I'm hooked, I admit it.
To riff off a few things you said, one is, go ahead.
As you mentioned, the Olympics is such a symbol of unity, countries getting together, showing sportsmanship and, healthy competition. My question to you is a tough one, but why do you think that across the globe right now, it's seemingly so difficult for countries to cooperate? And more generally, is cooperation between states possible? Is conflict between states inevitable?
Thanks, Will. First, I'd say there's healthy competition at the Olympics, but there's also something else going on. When they do the medal counts as countries, so there's a bit of nationalism there. I also remember things like, I have to get my years right, I think it was 56, and it was right around the time of the Soviet invasion of, I think it was Hungary. And then you had the Olympic event. I'm not sure if it was ice hockey or something in the water between the Soviet and the Hungarian team. It was more than healthy competition, man. it was conflict by another name. And then, you saw it during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, all the complaints about the East German judges. You saw it, perhaps the most famous moment was the Munich Olympics, when you had it was Jesse Owens running and in front of Hitler, and all the with all the nonsense and the grotesquerie about the master race, having this African American win the gold. So the Olympics, yes, there's a pure quality to it, but it's not totally removed. And most recently there's been doping, there's been corruption. So I enjoy it, but my glasses are not rose colored. Yeah, but and there are moments, by the way, I don't mean to be too cynical, of sportsmanship. You see, I think there's the respect of athlete for athlete, and you see that, and that's always impressive. In part because they're the only ones who understand what the others have gone through. There's an empathy that no one else can have, what it's like to train and what it's like to sacrifice and commit yourself. So I think that still matters a lot to a lot of these people. Those are the only people who can really identify with what they've had to do to get to that point. I can go on about sports for a long time. I'm basically a frustrated sports journalist. And one of my favorite gigs is I do Morning Joe once or twice a week. And whenever there's a golf tournament, I am Morning Joe's or MSNBC's golf correspondent. And that's really the what I do now. But I digress. Look, I don't think cooperation is the natural way of things. I am a realist in the School of Foreign Policy. I do think that competition is at the core of international relations. Nationalism, nation states are the principal unit. I don't think the competition is without constraint, but the constraint is, again, out of national self-interest. Countries enter into agreements not because they're feel-gooders, but because the agreements leave them better off. So whether they're bilateral agreements, say like U.S., even say Soviet or Russian arms control agreements, or again, they enter into them, they accept limits because what they get in return tends to justify whatever it is they give up. But if you look at international relations now, first of all, the friction points are becoming greater, and cooperation, where there ought to be cooperation, is lacking. Take climate change. That's a situation that will affect everybody. But the scale of international cooperation is so far short of what will be of what is required. It's the reason that we're having the effects of climate change as fast as we have them and as much as we have them. So even though there is a powerful argument for international cooperation, it's not materializing. You look at the UN system, it's mostly a failure. The last round of global trade talks, the Doha round, collapsed in failure. I've already talked about climate change. The world has essentially sat on its hands and has been unable to rein in Russian aggression in Ukraine. I can go around the world, but you just had a stolen election in Venezuela. What is the world going to do about it? Absolutely nothing. And the reason is countries put national interests before anything collective. That to me is a fact of life. So to me, the answer is not to act alone, but I'm always interested in forms of collective effort that are narrower than international. So the General Assembly at the UN probably has, 190, 200 members. Well, there's such a lowest common denominator thing going on there. That's not, to me, a terribly useful place. But that's why alliances are important, or coalitions of the willing, where you get groupings of like-minded countries willing and able to do some useful things together. So it's a much narrower, almost bespoke form of multilateralism. But I think that's the way to think about cooperation, on a selective basis rather than a universal basis. I mean, universalism has been the great dream for centuries, and you look at Kant, you look at the League of Nations, you look at the UN, but it's failed. So to me, the answer to that is not to give up on high-minded goals. It's not to give up on collective effort, but to design and implement your collective effort among those countries, or not even necessarily countries, I'll get to that in a second, but those entities, we'll say, who are most willing to work together and who are most relevant. And if the area is, say, global health, what you want to get are a number of countries, but you've also got to get the Gates Foundation and the pharma companies. Or if you're thinking about something on climate change, they'll want to get energy companies or technology companies involved. And by the way, probably 15 countries matter the most on climate, probably account for 80, 90% of greenhouse gas emissions. So let's focus on those rather than the other 185 countries. I have a very practical approach to cooperation, but even practical approaches don't get very far. India and others have been China have been tremendously resistant to cooperation on climate. We still don't know what happened in Wuhan and the breakout of COVID-19, though I think I've got a pretty good idea of what. So I just think we've got to be really hard-headed about the nature of international relations and what to expect from global cooperation or global institutions.
I want to quickly riff off a few things you said. Real quick, I want to riff off a few things you said. One is the ping pong, and it brought to mind ping pong diplomacy, Nixon, Mao, and whenever I see the medal count, I think about how the rise of China can kind of almost associate with the rise of their medal count. And that's probably too broad of an analogy, but they're second in the medal count, and that's pretty impressive. The other quick thing is you mentioned Ukraine, and right now there's the battles that's happening at Kursk. And for the military folks, the Battle of Kursk in World War II was the largest armor battle ever between the Nazi and Soviets. And then the last thing I kind of want to riff off is how World War II and present day, and how I know this is kind of a little bit too much of a tangent, but Ohtani, every time he hits a home run, sometimes he wears a samurai hat. And that would have never been the case in America in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. Like World War II veterans would have been like, no way. Yeah. And so all of that is a preface to, we want to now talk about home and away, but more specifically away. And Will has a ton of questions around away and international affairs. So Will, back to you.
Hold on, Tim, I wanted to riff off of your riff, if I could, because you mentioned three things. There was Kursk, there was Ohtani, and what was the first diplomacy. One? Ping pong. Okay, so very quickly. We still have the medal count. The United States and China are number 1 and 2, and that's totally reflective of geopolitics and economics. These are the two most important countries of this era of history, world's two largest economies. So it's representative. It's not an outlier. What's also to me really interesting is sports are so emblematic of the difference in the Chinese and American approaches. China has this top-down national approach to preparing for the Olympics. It's identifying athletes at an early stage in their lives, whole national program. It's exactly what their society and their economies are. We're just the opposite. We're bottom up. We're chaotic. And so it's just fascinating. One could write a really interesting book about how countries prepare for sports at the national level, the Olympics, and what it tells you. It's actually it's so revealing about how they organize themselves for all else. I was thinking about it actually a few hours ago when you had the men's 400 relay and they dropped the baton. And it was a lack of certain organization on the U.S. Side, which is, shall we say, a strength and a weakness of our approach. Look, the Battle of Kursk is really interesting. The historical, as you alluded to, this is not a battle so much as there's a battle, but it's an incursion. It's not a counteroffensive. It's much more modest. It clearly caught the Russians by surprise, but it wasn't like they didn't have warning. It's interesting. The more we learn about what happened over the last week, there was warning that Ukrainians, I think, surprised, not because they hid, but because the Russians didn't take warning seriously. And if that sounds a little bit like Israel and Hamas on October 7th, or Israel in October 73, it's because it does. Or to some extent, us with Pearl Harbor. There's a history of ignoring warning when it doesn't fit your mindset. And I was involved, I've made my share of mistakes in the run-up to the Iraq War, the assumptions about Saddam and weapons of mass destruction. And the takeaway is how powerful assumptions are in framing what it is you think you're seeing. So I remember when Saddam wasn't cooperating with weapons inspectors, we assumed it was because he was hiding the fact that he had weapons of mass destruction. Guess what? He was hiding the fact that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. But we didn't see it because we were so wedded to a certain mindset. And that's what I think surprise in military history often has less to do with the hiding than it does with the flawed perception of the side, if you will, that's on the receiving end of the surprise. So it's a good lesson for life, which is just to constantly identify and test your assumptions. Assumptions are really powerful things, and they can be dangerous things if they blind you to certain reality. It's the kind of thing doctors have to guard against all the time when they're looking at symptoms and so forth. I lost one of my closest friends. He was the best man at my wedding. Why? He was a long distance runner, and he had a bad cough, and it never occurred to the doctor. And he never smoked in his life, and it never occurred to the doctor that he could have lung cancer because he had none of the behavioral traits that are associated with it. And by the time they figured it out, it was too late. It just, in this case, a tragic outcome. But assumptions can be really dangerous things. And my view is not to have them, but to identify them and then to test them constantly. The Japanese thing is really interesting. You mentioned Otani. I think one of the least remarked upon but most important stories of the last 10 or 15 years in the field of international relations is the rise of Japan. Not just the rise of Japan, but the change in Japan. Japan is, I would say, if you said, Richard, what is the most important ally of the United States? My answer, Japan. It is the world's third largest economy, one of the world's most capable militaries, and it is our principal strategic partner against our principal strategic challenger of the century, which is China. Japan is pivotal to our ability to deter, or if deterrence fails, defend against Chinese aggression against Taiwan. And what Otani's willingness to associate himself with certain, I don't know him. I admire him from a distance. But what I think this is saying, this is a different Japan. This is a Japan that is no longer post-World War II Japan, living under constraints that were either imposed on it or were self-imposed because of this national collective sense of apology and shame. I think what we now have is what I would call post-World War II Japan. This is a more normal Japan. This is a Japan that is much more comfortable asserting itself, of taking on roles and responsibilities more commensurate with today's world, with its power. So when I see someone like Otani, to me, what that says is it's a sign of the emergence of a more modern Japan, which overwhelmingly, I believe, has been a welcome development. Will, you were going to ask?
Yeah, related to that, to discuss China, Taiwan. Many have called Taiwan the Berlin crisis of the 21st century. And I'm just wondering, what does deterring Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific mean in practice? You speak of being a realist previously. Would China not see our efforts to strengthen alliances in the region, either formally or informally? Additionally, increase military presence as a direct act of aggression against their own sovereignty? How do you prevent further escalation in the region?
The answer is no. The answer not at all. Well, I can't say how they speak, but we're not preparing to invade China. This is not preparations for aggression. What we've basically said to China is, you're allowed to have whatever dreams you want. To use Middle Eastern terminology, you can have whatever views of final status you want when it comes to Taiwan and the mainland. You just can't act on them in a coercive manner. So what we're committed to is process rather than outcome. So what we're telling the mainland is, we are going to, technically our policy is, you cannot rule out the possibility we will come to Taiwan's direct defense. What we haven't pledged, this is strategic ambiguity rather than clarity, we haven't formally pledged that we would come to Taiwan's defense. And indeed, it's quite possible that one of the many reasons this election is important is there may be differences between Vice President Harris and President Trump on willingness to come to Taiwan's direct defense. But in any case, U.S. policy as it exists is that we won't rule out that we might do it. And that means, again, what's foreign policy about at the end of the day? Foreign policy is about shaping the foreign policy choices of other countries. So our goal is to shape what China does, or in this case, doesn't do. We don't want it to use military force to change the political configuration with Taiwan. So that means everything from preparing economic sanctions to preparing to use military force. If China acts against Taiwan, it's the United States, it's Taiwan, it's Japan, potentially others. And that means planning, capabilities, and so forth. And I would say, China has built up dramatically in the last decade or two. If there's an aggressive quality to what's happened in that part of the world, it's Chinese military preparations, Chinese statements. So the threat is all in one direction. And what we have to do, I think, is narrow the gap between where we are and where we need to be if we are going to be confident of our ability to deter. I don't want to fight a war there. And I certainly don't want to fight a war of liberating Taiwan as opposed to defending Taiwan. So to me, the goal is to, again, you can't get China to dream differently, but you can get it to act differently, or in this case, not act. So I just think we have to persuade Xi Jinping and other Chinese decision makers is that the cost of acting on their goals with Taiwan would outweigh any benefits. The cost economically, the cost militarily, and so forth. And again, where I'm slightly uneasy is I don't believe we're doing enough to convey that message with the clarity it ought to be conveyed. But that's essentially, I would say, this whole debate about the pivot and all that. But we're not where we need to be, and it's part of actually a larger problem. This is, you got people on this listening to this who know a lot more about things military than I do. But I think we've got a larger problem here, which is we simply don't have the force structure and size or characteristics or the defense industrial base that we need. We're facing a present and a future where we've got three geographies at a minimum: the Middle East, Europe, and the Asia Pacific, what's sometimes now called the Indo-Pacific. And we simply don't have the numbers of systems. We don't nearly have the kinds of systems. We have way too few high-value systems that are vulnerable to very cheap, easily proliferated drones and missiles and so forth. We don't have the ability to surge the production of equipment or ammunition. I think we've got a problem that far transcends Taiwan. Taiwan is one of the places we see the consequences. But I really worry that we don't have, and I don't see us particularly moving quickly towards what I think is the military we need, given what's emerging as the basis of 21st century threats coming from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and given the new technologies. There's a real gap between where we are and where we need to be. Taiwan is simply one of the places. But imagine we faced a situation which is not crazy, where Putin threatens to do something more against Ukraine or against NATO, against Poland or somebody, or some other country in Europe. Iran and Israel are going at it, and then China moves against Taiwan. Does anyone seriously think we have the quantity and quality of systems we need to comfortably deal with that? When I was in the Pentagon in the 70s, long before either of you were, I expect, around, the big debate was about the 2.5 war strategy and whether we had enough forces to simultaneously fight a large contingency in Europe and a large contingency in Asia. Those were the two principal arenas of the Cold War, and deals with a smaller contingency elsewhere. We weren't close then, but we were a lot closer then than we are now. And we need to have a much more serious conversation. I actually think we need to expand what we spend on defense significantly, but more important than how much we spend is how we spend it. And we need a serious conversation in this country about how we spend our defense dollars. Because right now, we don't get nearly enough bang for our bucks. We spend $900 billion a year on defense. We don't have $900 billion of outcome. And I'd say the same thing about Europe. Europe probably spends, I don't know, plus or minus $300 billion a year on defense. And again, so much of it's done nationally. So rather than just hammering the Europeans on how much they spend, I'd really like to see us having a serious conversation with them on how they spend it. Why don't they pool their efforts much more and have continental-wide systems, or different countries specialize, so the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Right now, the whole is less than the sum of its parts in Europe, and the same thing is true here. So again, almost always, I'd make a general rule. You were kind enough to call me a public intellectual before, Tim. In public policy, as a rule, far, far more important than how much you spend is how you spend it. That's true of defense. It's true of healthcare. We spend twice the OECD average per capita on healthcare. Last I checked, we're not twice as healthy and we don't live twice as long. We often spend, a lot more on education per capita than other countries. Meanwhile, we're not competitive on various standardized tests around the world. What we need are far more debates, not about the quantity of resources, but how the resources are being spent.
Will, I think you had one more question.
Yeah, I mean, sure. You touch on this a little bit, but, I'm wondering, how severe is the collective threat that we face from what has been called the axis of upheaval? So the growing alliance, shared common interests between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And is an all-out global conflict to reshape the world order in our future?
Look, in my last job in government, which is now 21 years ago, I used to say I was director of policy planning, not policy predicting. And second of all, I wouldn't necessarily call these countries an alliance. I think more they're a little bit less than that. For example, we're not seeing direct military intervention by them on behalf of Russia in Ukraine, and so forth. So, but they are helping one another to varying degrees. So I think more they're in alignment. I would call them more in alignment. And yeah, I worry about it. And again, because they can all together or individually, they can do harm. And then collectively, they can help each other. So North Korea or Iran is clearly, for example, doing things to help Russia, as is China in Ukraine. Russia's doing things apparently to help North Korea's nuclear program. So I take this seriously. And again, it's why this is a demanding moment for the United States. Good news is we have this network of alliances. It's the great structural comparative advantage of American foreign policy. We've got dozens of countries in Europe. We've got Japan, Australia, South Korea, and others in Asia. So we've got partners, and we've got this pool of partners we can call upon, hopefully to deter and, if need be, to collectively defend. And I actually think NATO has stepped up rather well in the case of Russian aggression against Ukraine. It's been a pretty impressive response. Not a lot of people 2.5 years ago thought that Ukraine would essentially be able to fight Russia to a standstill. Pretty impressive. And they're doing it, by the way, on their own in terms of manpower. They're short of manpower, but they're not, there's been no direct involvement of the United States or Europe. We've been indirectly involved economically and military. So, but again, alliances, relationships are force multipliers. But again, this is a demanding time. So sure, I worry about the Chinas, the Russias. They're not 10 feet tall. I think they're all brittle. China has enormous economic problems, enormous demographic problems, as does Russia. But brittle countries in the short run can cause real harm. So I take the threats posed by them seriously, and we underestimate them at tremendous risk to ourselves. Look, this is a dangerous moment in world history. And I've been in this business now half a century. And this, in many ways, is the most dangerous moment, in part because there's a number of distinct threats, but they are to varying degrees aligned. It's a time of fast-changing technology, and I don't think we're in the right part of the curve there, or the loop. And what worries me most of all, and it's the reason that I write a newsletter called Home and Away, and not just Away. The reason my last book was on American democracy is why I worry about us. That we have played this large, outsized role in the world for 75 years, from our entry in World War II until recently. And it's been an amazing run of history. I actually think historians will come and look at these 75 years, not as perfect, but as something of a golden age. No great power conflict, expansion of people enjoying rights and freedoms, tremendous expansion of wealth, tremendous extension of lifespans. It's been a remarkable year, but it didn't just happen. Good things never just happen in history. And I would argue the greatest single driver has been the United States. We've played this large, often generous role in propping up, designing, and then maintaining an international order, an alliance system, and so forth. And what worries me is it's not clear that we're going to continue doing that. We could do it if we wanted. The question is whether we want to. And I would just simply say I can't answer that question. And for the first time in my life, that is a question. And that either because we'll be distracted, or we'll be at odds with ourselves, or we simply will enter into a new bout of isolationism, or what have you. And the world will not do well by itself, trust me. I know a lot of people traditionally on the left and the right worry about that the United States doing too much in the world and think, America, go home. Well, the only thing worse than the United States doing too much, I would think, is the United States doing too little. And the world is not some self-organizing, modulating place. So that's why I'm so worried about this moment. It's this confluence of new technologies, global challenges, the rise of some real competitors who want to overturn the international system, and more than anything else, the United States that is no longer convinced it needs to play a large role in the world. And that's a dangerous brew.
This has been such a fascinating conversation, and it's the reason why I've read your books and read your newsletter, Home and Away. Thoughtful, insightful, the breadth of analysis. I want to close us out with some rapid fire questions. One is favorite books.
Well, the book that influenced me most in the field, since we've been talking about international relations, is a book by an Australian academic named Hedley Bull, and it's called The Anarchical Society. And the reason, he was a personal friend, but the reason it has such an impact on me to this day is the title is a very useful framing. It's the two words, anarchy and society. And at any moment in history, what you have is the competition or the balance or imbalance between forces of anarchy and forces of society. So I find it a very useful construct that I constantly return to in my own thinking. Second of all, a book I often recommend is a book called Thinking in Time. The uses of history for decision makers, but it could be the uses of history for anybody, for citizens trying to figure out what's going on and all that. It's by two of my former colleagues at the Kennedy School, Dick Neustadt and Ernie May. And it looks at how, again, it's the guide to how to use but also not abuse history, historical analogies, and so forth. It's wonderfully written. So I like those two books tremendously. One last book, if you're going to read, again, I still think the greatest book about our own country is the Federalist Papers. And if you want to understand the DNA of American democracy, you could do a lot worse than read the Federalists.
Favorite movies? Guessing maybe Far and Away, given Home and Away, but it's not that good of a movie,
Yeah.
but it's an interesting movie.
Okay, so I'm not going to give you anything highbrow. I just watched the other night, and every time I watch it, it slays me, and I still can't believe it didn't win the Academy. Is E.T.? I think E.T. is one of the greatest movies ever made. I love it. So that's on my short list. I love Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Still love Animal House. I got let me put it this way, Tim. There's a difference between movies and films. And you didn't ask me my favorite film, and that's kind of highfalutin. Then we can talk about this or that Japanese or Swedish filmmaker, and we could get really intellectual and abstract and all that. But I kind of like pretty basic movies. So I've given you a few.
I thought you were going to choose something to your point, like the Battle of Algiers or something that was very...
Well, Battle of Algiers is one of the great foreign. It's the 7 Days in May. There's certain On the Beach. There's a whole genre. And I can't remember which one. Is it 7 Days in May or one of them, where you have the great historical line where the general goes, gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Dr. Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove. Yeah, there you go. And so, yeah, I think, it'd be fun to teach a course one day on movies and foreign policy. I could get into that.
Favorite musicians or songs or musical genres?
Love John Prine. Anything by John Prine. My favorite group historically was the Grateful Dead. Went to more than my share of Dead concerts. And now my favorite, they've been slightly supplanted, though my ringtone is Ripple. I will admit to that on my phone. But my favorite group these days is Fleetwood Mac. Can't get enough Fleetwood Mac in my life. It's just every time I hear Stevie Nicks, it places me.
Fleetwood Mac is amazing. Favorite leaders, historical or present?
In my own life, let me give you two, both I worked with. So it's too many historical leaders. But I will say one thing about one grouping, both of whom I met, but I never worked with. The one my favorite president who I worked for, as I said, is George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st president. And I think history will see him really well in what he did and how he did it. And, successes often look inevitable in retrospect. They didn't seem so inevitable at the time. The peaceful end of the Cold War, the handling of the Gulf War rocks invasion of Kuwait. He deserves a lot of credit. I just think 41 was a gentleman. And I had more, it was the greatest collection of people working with him and Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft and Bob Gates. I remember one day it was Brent, Bob, and I sitting together. We used to meet every Saturday, three of us, in Brent's small office in the West Wing. And Brent would always say, okay, guys, what aren't we thinking of? And we would just spend an hour or two together every Saturday morning thinking about the world and where we had it wrong, where we had it right, what assumptions weren't we testing. And I remember once we were laughing, I can't remember what it was, and just Bob saying, it doesn't, guys, it'll never get better than this. And he was right. Government at its best is really, really good. And to me, that administration was often government at its best. So one was 41. And to the extent I had a mentor, in many ways, it was Brent, about Brent Scowcroft, about how to conduct yourself in government. He was the best national security advisor, I would argue, we've ever had. The other person was Yitzhak Rabin. I was the Middle East guy at the White House when Rabin was first defense minister and then prime minister of Israel. And what was so interesting about Rabin, here he was, this hardened man of war, unlike most Israelis. He was a chain smoker, he was a scotch drinker, wasn't good with small talk, but he pivoted. And he became a man of peace, not starry-eyed, not idealistic. And I remember his standing on the White House lawn saying, this isn't easy for me. But there was a willingness to confront himself and to change and do difficult things. And because he was a reluctant peacemaker, it gave him great credibility. And the tragedy of Rabin was his assassination, and not just in the personal sense, but it was one of those assassinations that truly, truly, truly changed history. Because he may well have been the last Israeli leader who had both the desire and the ability to make peace. Others have had the desire, like Shimon Peres, but not the ability politically. And Bibi Netanyahu has the ability if he wanted to, but doesn't want to. Yitzhak Rabin had both. And his assassination truly changed the course, I would argue, of history of Israel, Palestinians, the Middle East. But he was an extraordinary person. The other thing I would say, and I met them both separately, were, and it's a lesson here, which is why I'll mention it, was Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. And obviously Mandela is one of the great heroes of the 20th century, late 20th century, and so forth. But what people forget, and it's why I mention it, is that peacemaking requires a partner. And what was Mandela's great fortune is that he had F.W. de Klerk as a partner, because he needed someone who could deliver the Afrikaners. Mandela could promise that the majority would not be vengeful, but Mandela could not deliver the minority that had enjoyed power. And it took the two of them that were willing and able to make peace. And that to me is, and I had elements of that when I was in Northern Ireland. I was able to find people across the divide on the Protestant side and the Catholic side who were willing and able to make peace. And it's a lesson for all situations now, is that you've got to sometimes not just look at individuals in history, but you've got to look at pairs of individuals, whether you've got a partner. One last person, again, I didn't know him, but probably the greatest person of, I would say, the 20th century was Churchill. If you had to think about who was the one person who changed history more than any other in a positive way, then I'd find it hard to argue with Churchill as the choice.
I want to build upon two things you said and then ask the final question, and that is credibility. We talked about Nixon and ping pong diplomacy. It's oftentimes the people who have the most credibility who can take the most risks. No, I feel like Nixon, given how he's very hawkish and Republican, and him doing China with Zhou Enlai, and the same I feel like with Yitzhak Rabin, and the same I feel with Eisenhower with talking about the military-industrial complex. Like the people who have the most credibility on topics can criticize it the most, and people will we'll take it more. I guess we'll embrace it more. And then the second thing I want to build upon is we had another guest who also said they really respected Bush 41, and they said that he balanced the budget, and then he said when he ran for office, no new taxes, and he got really destroyed for doing that. And it maybe goes upon the credibility in that, like, he was Republican, but yet he was someone who increased the taxes, and maybe that's also why we have a bit more respect on him. But final question is what?
Well, I'm not going to remember. You're already giving me more than I can remember, so you can ask your final question. Look, on Bush 41, I think we can argue whether he ever should have said no new taxes. That was a campaign thing. He then had to change. The fact he was willing to change, knowing he would pay a political price for it, pretty impressive. Pretty impressive. Talk about putting the country, the 10th obligation in my book, the Bill of Obligations, to put country before person or party. 41 did exactly that. Where he made a mistake there was in not selling it. He was so modest. He often thought that doing the right thing was enough. And I remember arguing that he had to go, he should have called a primetime Oval Office speech and gone to the American people and say, look, I know I'm going back on my word. You're going to be angry at me, but let me tell you why I'm doing it. And I think if he had done that, it might have turned out better for him politically. So the lesson I take is it's necessary to do the right thing. Obviously, it's laudatory when people are willing to do it, particularly at personal risk, but it's not enough just to do it. You've got to explain in politics. And I think 41 failed to explain. You mentioned Nixon. I never forgot the line. Someone once said, I can't remember who it was, only Nixon could go to China because only Nixon didn't have Nixon to worry about. He wasn't going to be criticized because quite possibly Richard Nixon would have been tough. But look, Nixon wrote about it in Foreign Affairs before he became president. He also was something of a public intellectual. And if you go back and read the article he wrote, it must have been 67 or 68. It's a really important article. And he argued that we cannot forever leave China outside the family of nations. He made the case. And then he and Henry Kissinger, I think, deserve great credit for doing it. Again, it was creative. It was a big idea that was well implemented. And that's what you need, by the way, in government or anywhere else. There's a design phase and an implementation phase. One without the other is inadequate, is insufficient. And Nixon and Kissinger were pretty good, I thought, for whatever flaws both of them had. But the China initiative was a good example of, I thought, brilliant design, well executed.
Final question. If America today was a stock, would you buy it, would you sell it, or would you hold it?
It's a great question. No one's ever asked me it before. I'd be somewhere between hold and buy. I'd say hold because I'm not sure what's going to happen with the election. We're 3 months away from what's truly a historic election. And this is an uncharacteristic election. Most elections of the modern era, say going back since World War II, the differences between the candidates was far less than the similarities. In which case, my answer to your question would always be buy, because continuity could be safely assumed. Right now, there's more up for grabs in two phases. I don't know what's going to happen between now and Election Day. We then have 75 days between Election Day and Inauguration Day. I worry about that. That's when January 6th happened 4 years ago. I can imagine, you don't have to be wildly creative to imagine certain scenarios where we go through some very difficult times. If there's challenges to the election outcome, to who's sent to the electoral college and so forth. So I worry about that 75-day period under certain scenarios. And then I worried about our ability to govern. We talked about the domestic questions about our willingness and ability to act effectively in the world. So I'm not giving up. So at a minimum, I'd hold. I'd like to say I'd buy, but I think to some extent it depends. I'd buy in the long run. I'm a little bit more worried about the near run. And so at a minimum, I'd never sell us. No reason to. We have too many innate constraints. But I also think, how would I put it? We shouldn't sugarcoat our challenges. You talked about some of the international challenges now. They're significant, both at the global level as well as certain actors who only mean us ill. We've got some real domestic challenges that we're not meeting, whether it's the border, the quality of public education. The American dream, more than anything else, depends upon quality public education. That's the great ladder for American society. Well, that's great in principle, but it's not there in practice for many Americans. In way, way, way too many school districts, public education is not a ladder. It's not offering people a path to a future. And for too many Americans, the American dream is just a dream. It's not a reality anymore. So I think we've got to do a lot to make opportunity real in this country. We have enormous challenges like the debt that no one seems to have the political courage to want to deal with. So, it's easy to be kind of never sell America short. Yeah, I know all the lines. Churchill's line, America can be counted on to do the right thing, but only after it's done everything else. Don't sell America short. I get it. And I'm basically there, but I don't think what's always worked in the past necessarily works now. I mean, to give one statistic, when we were founded as a country, we had approximately 3 million people. We are now 340 million people. And I would simply say, in many ways, our politics haven't kept up. The technology environment has made it more difficult to run a democracy. We see it not just here, but elsewhere. We see populism not just here, but elsewhere. So I think these are difficult times. So rather than just kind of being, I could give you an easy answer saying, yeah, of course, buy and borrow as much as you can and buy because America's, and that I'd like to do that, but I'm more worried than that. And I actually feel this is a moment where no one has the luxury of being sanguine. I referenced my book before, my most recent book, The Bill of Obligations. Be informed, be involved. Put country before person. There are certain injunctions there. And so we'll come out in the right place, but it's not preordained. It'll only come out in the right place if enough people in this country do the right thing. And that's on us. And so again, I'm not negative, but I also am not sanguine in the sense that it's confident it's automatically going to turn out okay. Hopefully, yes. I'd even say probably yes, but not automatically yes. And that's, again, it's a time for we the people to get informed, to get involved, and bring about the outcomes we need.
Richard, this was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your strategic, analytical, descriptive, and breadth of knowledge, truly. And this is why I highly recommend people subscribe to Home and Away and order Richard's book, The Bill of Obligations. Richard, thank you so very much. I hope you enjoy the weekend.
Thank you, gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of summer and be well. Be safe and
Thank
be
you,
well.
sir.